Aloha everyone. I wanted to talk about this story that just came out in a British tabloid about Britain's SAS being trained to fight with extraterrestrials. Now that really got my attention because in the mainstream media, people are speculating about this being something that might happen one day when contact happens with extraterrestrial life. But of course, for those of you that have been following my exopolitics research, that happened a long time ago. And in fact, when we look at the literature concerning exopolitics, contact with extraterrestrial life, there are a number of sources that talk about special operators, special forces being trained to fight with extraterrestrials. Now, the first time I came across this was from the testimony of Phil Schneider, a civil engineer who went public in 1995 with his reports of having been involved in a firefight at Dulce, New Mexico. He was giving public lectures about his work with the secret military underground facilities that were being built by the deep state, where that could house up to 10,000 people. And as a civil engineer, he talked about how his job was to map out and do what was necessary to understand what exactly could be built in a particular location. And he described one of the locations as Dulce, New Mexico. And he says that in 1979, he went there to Dulce and that he was looking at a way to expand on an existing base that was there that somehow involved extraterrestrials, and that there was already an agreement. And so he was there in Dulce looking at the mesa in developing a shaft for whether it was to find a way into an existing base or a way to explore expanding an existing base. I can't quite recall exactly what the possibilities were, what he was saying, but nevertheless he says that he went in there with teams of special operators, mainly Army Delta Force special operators. Around 1979, I believe that's when they were first being developed. And so he says he went down there with these special operators and they came across an annex where there were these tall grey extraterrestrials. So the tall greys apparently wanted the Army Special Forces to disarm. They refused, and so it led to a firefight. And there was somewhere around 50 to 60 Army Special Forces guys that had lost their lives in that, as well as a number of scientists. Phil Schneider says he got away. I think he said he was the only one that survived that firefight on the human side. He says he lost several fingers from his hand. And this was later verified by people that met Phil Schneider, that he talked about this incident and that this was where he lost a few of his fingers on his hand. So that was in 1979. Now what made that particularly interesting was that 10 years later, in 1989, Bob Lazar says that he read a briefing packet about extraterrestrial life and heard about this firefight in Dulce. So he heard about this firefight, and he, in the briefing document, I recall that he said it happened around 1975 and that it was at Los Alamos, an underground facility at Los Alamos. So I think it may have been the same incident. Maybe the date and the location was confused. But anyway, I always thought it was very interesting that Robert Lazar talked about this firefight between human special operators and grey extraterrestrials. That was very interesting. But those aren't the only incidents involving human special forces operators clashing with extraterrestrials. There have been others that have come forward to talk about that. One of the earliest reports I came across was this gentleman, Michael Ralph, who did work with the US Navy for 6 years. He says that he was recruited in 1976 when he joined boot camp, Navy boot camp, that he was recruited into the secret space program. So he actually was the first secret space program whistleblower or insider that I ever learned about. And I learned about him back in 2003 or sometime around that period, just after I began my exopolitics research. He and his wife at the time put out a website called the Mars Records, and it basically detailed his 20 and back program where he was taken to Mars. But he says that he was trained to fight extraterrestrials, that he was trained as a psychic assassin, if you like, to do this work. So again, you have this training of special operators to fight against extraterrestrials. Now, one of the most intriguing reports I've come across is in a book called Planetary Intervention. And it concerns a serviceman from Portugal who says that around 1989, he was recruited into this worldwide special forces program to fight against extraterrestrials. And so he described the training in his book, Planetary Intervention. He described the training for this program where he would do things like work alongside other special forces or special operators from other countries. For example, he describes being a native in Brazil, that when he did his training there in Brazil, it obviously involved working in the rainforest, in the Amazon, and doing survival training there. And so he says that this is probably one of the most brutal programs for special operations training in the world, in Brazil. Special operators, SEALs, Delta Force, Army Rangers, Britons, SAS, special operators from all over the world will go to Brazil into the rainforest to do whether it's a couple of weeks of survival training in the jungle. And this Brazilian special operator says it is particularly brutal. For every 10 operators, from these elite services from around the world, only seven of them make it through the training. So it's quite brutal. The others just kind of opt out. Now, this Brazilian operator, he used the pseudonym Daniel in the book, Planetary Intervention. He says that as he completed his training, they were given futuristic technologies and that they would go to places where there were wars being waged. And he says that one of the places that he went to was Bosnia during the Serbian or the Yugoslav civil wars, quite a brutal war. And he says that he was there to do training, but also surveillance of extraterrestrials. At some point in his training, he'd received full briefings about extraterrestrials that were here, and that they were interacting with the human population. And what they would often do would be that they would go to battle zones and they would abduct people, observe the fighting and abduct people, and sometimes even participate in the fighting themselves. Somehow this was something that the extraterrestrials sought. So anyway, he says that he went there as part of a squad, part of a team, and he says that he engaged with these extraterrestrials, short grey extraterrestrials. And actually there was a photo of one, and very interesting photo. I will include that in the link to this podcast for those interested. And this photo shows a grey extraterrestrial crouching down in front of some rocks. Very interesting. I haven't been able to authenticate the photo, but it's included in his book. It's certainly not something that appears anywhere else other than in his book. So very interesting that this is something that he says occurred in Bosnia. But what's really interesting is that he says that there is this planetary organization that trains these special operators from around the world to be part of these missions where these operators are outfitted with very advanced technologies, and they go out hunting for extraterrestrials. Or at the very least, they're on the lookout for extraterrestrials who are hunting for humans in conflict zones. So essentially the story is that the extraterrestrials regard Earth as a battle zone, really, and that for well over a millennia, some agreement has been in place where extraterrestrials will come here incognito, not announcing themselves to official government sources and so forth, and hunt human soldiers. And apparently Daniel said that his team was part of these elite trained warriors whose job it would be to fight with extraterrestrials who were sent here on these missions to train and fight against human special forces operators. So very interesting that how we send special operators to places like the Amazon forest in Brazil for survival training. The extraterrestrials will send their special forces operators to Earth, to conflict zones where there are humans who either are engaged in a conflict or whose job it is to find and hunt the extraterrestrials. So according to Daniel, he says that the ratio of survival for the teams that he was a part of working with these, seeking out and fighting these extraterrestrials was around 6-1. For every 6 special forces operators that were killed, they were able to kill 1 extraterrestrial. And the extraterrestrials included greys, they included reptilians. The reptilians obviously are the fighters, the most ferocious fighters. So this essentially is saying that the scenes depicted in the Predator series of movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger are actually based in fact. That extraterrestrials will come here to conflict zones, either to fight against one or both sides in a conflict, the soldiers that for them is kind of like their special training, or they go into a zone where these special operators that are trained by this worldwide organization to find and hunt and fight against extraterrestrials, that they're sent to these locations, and it's more or less survival training for both teams. So essentially this story about Britain's SAS being trained for future combat operations against all sorts of protagonists, adversaries, including extraterrestrials, I don't think that's speculating about future scenarios at all. Britain's SAS, some of those guys have been trained along with the United States special operators, special forces like Delta, Navy SEALs, Marine Special Forces to fight against extraterrestrials. This has been going on for decades now. So very interesting story. I'll put links on my website accompanying this podcast for those that want to learn more about it. So thank you for listening. This has been Dr. Michael Salla with Exopolitics Today.